zone at 7 p.m., right? Are you at 7 p.m.? Really, thank you for joining us at 7 p.m. We appreciate it.
Well, we lost Lori. So what do you think? I can go ahead and start, or we can wait for Lori to come back.
Maybe we could give her like 30 seconds to see if she jumps back in, and otherwise, that would be great, Sarah.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Or I can just make up an introduction for you as we go here, Sarah, if that's better. Not make up the
That'd be fun.
of your life, but do an on the fly one.
I think I'm back. Am I still talking?
Here we
It's
go.
going to take over for me.
We were just about to, Lori, but since you're back, go ahead. You can take over for yourself.
You can all ask Adam how I left my car door open for 5 hours today in the parking lot. So that's my Monday. As I said, Sarah's an alumni of our department, but she's currently an associate professor in biology and with the STEM Transformation Institute at Florida International. She received her bachelor's at Purdue in biological sciences, and again, her PhD in zoology here at Oregon State. Where she and I overlapped a little bit, but many of you probably know her from her time here. She then actually shifted gears a little bit and moved up to University of Washington, where she did a postdoc in DBER, which is discipline-based biology education research. And she worked with Mary Pat Wenderoth and Scott Freeman up there with a large group doing that. And then she went to the University of Texas at Austin, where she was a researcher there before she started her current position at FIU. And if you know Sarah, you know that with us, she trained as a behavioral ecologist, but she's now shifted kind of that behavioral ecology from thinking about salamanders in the field to thinking about behavior in the college classroom, where specifically her research focuses on how college instructors can contribute to the goal of equal participation of historically underrepresented groups in science careers, particularly by documenting disparities in student experiences and working with faculty to deploy interventions to address those disparities. And you all know that we've been working on this as a department quite a bit, so I'm really excited to have Sarah here, and her work has been highlighted really broadly for her work on equity, justice, and inclusion in the New York Times and the Atlantic and Science Magazine, and insights into diversity. So we really appreciate you bringing your expertise back to our department, Sarah. So welcome.
Awesome. Happy to be here. And thanks everyone for joining on probably a bit of a chaotic week, right? It's your second week of classes. Somehow we're on week 7, so feels a little different. But today I wanted to talk to you about really thinking about the role that our course structures, our course climates, and the content that we teach influences biology students' success. So the structure of the talk today is I'm going to basically give you an overview of what my lab works on, and then go give you a vignette, just kind of a short story, a case study of each of those things. What can we think about the influence of course structure, course climate, course content? And after each of those, I'll tell you a little bit about what my lab is working on currently, and then we'll go from there. So just to start us off, my lab really focuses on equity in and through biology education, biology college education. And when I talk about this, I'm talking about, like Lori said, how do we support minoritized biology majors, both in their motivation to pursue STEM and their success through our courses? So thinking about our instructional practices, our climate, and our content. I also think a lot about relationships, not just in the classroom, but also broadly for communicating science. And so we can think about in the classroom things like the instructor-student relationship and the importance of that for learning, or learning assistants or undergrad TAs, student relationships and the roles of those in the classroom. But we can also think about how critical relationships are for change, right? So if we think about the world around us, right, there's a lot of questioning of science, right? And there are some folks that as scientists, we may not be positioned to ever reach because we're not in those communities. We don't already exist in relationships with folks. But our students do. Our students come from a diversity of communities, right? And they can go home and they can talk about the things that they're learning with us. And because there's already trust built into the relationships that they have in their communities, they may be more impactful than we ever could. So some of my work is really thinking about how undergrads are taking the everyday conversations they're having with their parents, with their siblings, with their friends from high school, and how that could work to sort of bring science and trust in science to a larger group of folks. So that's sort of the range of what my lab currently works on. So now I want to jump into sort of these vignettes that are focused on our courses. And the first one is the role of course structures or instructional practices. So a lot of my work, almost all of it, focuses on classrooms that are using active learning. So active learning engages students in the process of learning through activities and discussions in class. And that definition is incredibly broad, right? Active learning is this umbrella term that means a lot of different things. And much of my kind of early work didn't try to separate that out, but tried to look at across all that noise, across all that variation, do we still see advantages to active learning over exclusively traditional lecture? We can have conversations about how much active learning and those sorts of things, but this was comparing to no active learning, right, to these variety of practices. And the graph you see here is from a meta-analysis we did quite a while ago now, where we looked at 158 published studies that were comparing active learning to traditional lectures. And we found that on average, the active learning increased student performance on assessments by about 6%, and students were 1.5 times actually more likely to fail in a traditional course than an active course. So it has large impacts on pass rates. This study, although really impactful and probably the only time in my life that I'm going to trend on Reddit, we were number 2 at one point. It actually, if I was an instructor, and I am, right, I teach, it doesn't actually tell me what to do, right? It doesn't give me practical tips because it's there's so many different ways to do active learning. And so from there, some of my work has really zoomed in on particular types of active learning. And so the one I've worked the most with is something called high structure. High structure has 3 elements, and it's been championed by folks like Mary Pat Linderoth and Scott Freeman. And those three elements are this: preparatory assignments, so daily or weekly sort of knowledge or comprehension level assignments that students complete before class, so they come in prepared, right? And these have to be graded. There needs to be some form of accountability. In-class activities is the other part of active learning or high structure. These will be at a higher level than the prep assignments, so knowledge or application and analysis. And it's on that week's material. And again, there's some sort of accountability built in there. And then the final element of a high structure course is review problems, some sort of review that aligns with the exams, what you're going to ask them on the exams. And again, some sort of accountability is present there, right? So these 3 elements are one way to approach active learning. And I want to kind of pause us here because I think this can be a really useful exercise to think about, why do these matter? Why might these matter? Why might these help students? And so we're actually going to send you out into breakout rooms for like a couple minutes. And I'd like you to come back with a hypothesis or two about why you think that these three pieces of structure, preparatory assignments, in-class activities, and review, might impact student performance and learning. Okay, so I don't think I have control over breakout rooms. Ooh, I do. Great, we'll do 10. All right, so I'm going to open the rooms, and please go ahead and talk with your peers about why you think these things might impact student learning. What do they do for them?
We're about 100 size out in the gas. And we have room. Not everybody.
So we are a room.
We're a room?
Yeah. I think that's okay, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, please, I don't know. Yes,
Otherwise, you're sending on to room 7.
right. No, you're all good.
So you're in the room.
I mean, looking at something ahead of time can help give you context before you learn in lecture. And be less lost.
I was gonna say with that, it's like you're working up to something instead of like trying to cram all your studying at the end and figure things out at the end. You're working up to it. Like you have these preparatory things, and then you do stuff in class, then you have review. It's all like step by step, helping you constantly work through steps and work through it over time instead of trying to remember everything the night before. You need to shovel it all out.
I think it's the passive to active, I think is the thing. So instead of lots of students passive, they just show up in the lecture and they want to just absorb the osmosis. That puts it right into the active category. And then,
Right.
like you said, that's why I think the accountability.
It gives people a chance to stop and think. Sometimes when you're just getting all this information, it's like you can't process it in time before then it's the next thing. So it gives you a chance to think about it for a second and like digest it and then go to the next.
So about 60 seconds left. I just gave a warning to the breakout rooms.
Another thing I think it helps with is kind of 3 touch points on one topic. And you might like not feel comfortable asking a question on that second one, but by the third, you're in a circumstance where you're okay. But I still don't get meiosis. So third time, let's talk about it. So I think it presents multiple opportunities.
So as you're coming back in, if you would be brave enough to share one of your hypotheses in the chat for other folks to see, that'd be great. And we've got a few seconds before everybody's back.
You're in the 2 meetings at the same time.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Again, if folks are willing, I'd love to see some hypotheses in the chat so that everyone can see what you've all been talking about and what you think is going on and why structures like this might be helpful to students.
Are we raising hands?
Yeah, if you're in the room, that'd be great. I'm sorry, I can barely see you. So
That's okay. Our group was saying that we really like the in-class activities to get the students talking, because when they have to, when they get to talk to their peers, sometimes being forced to explain it out loud yourself or answer the questions makes you realize what questions you have and where things are a little muddy, rather than just passively taking it in.
yeah, so it's an opportunity to try out your answer and realize what you don't already know, right? And possibly also to hear how someone else would explain it other than the professor too, which can be useful. Great. And there's a bunch of ideas in the chat as well. So thinking about scaffolding their learning, breaking down ideas into maybe more manageable pieces and then building up the complexity. Incentives to engage with the material. Our students aren't different than us, right? We are busy folks, and so are our students, and we do what has deadlines, right? That's what we prioritize, and our students are the same, right? So it gives them incentives to engage. Repetition, well, yeah, repetition, seeing things multiple times. Yeah, there's great stuff in here. Awesome, awesome. And no, 2 minutes is not enough time, but unfortunately, that's what we got. So I want to share what we were thinking as well. And I think you all have hit on a lot of these things. But we think that these course structures sort of engage students to employ best practices for learning. And some of these best practices are pretty robust in terms of the evidence for them and their impact on learning. So we think things like the required prep assignment and the review assignment, like folks mentioned, make students engage multiple times with the same content, and it distributes their learning. I also heard this discussed in the in-person room, right? They don't just do it right before the exam. They don't just cram, right? You're spreading their practice out. You're giving them multiple opportunities to engage. This impacts long-term learning. It increases long-term learning as well as short-term learning. There's also a really robust effect called the testing effect or retrieval practice, that the more that you test yourself, so put your notes away, test yourself, even if you get it wrong, you're strengthening the connections in your brain between the concepts. And so every time you do that, you're more likely to get the question right the next time. Not an identical question even, right? But like an isomorphic, something that's on a similar topic, because you're strengthening those connections. The in-class practice, we think about a lot about something called self-explaining or elaborative interrogation, where students are explaining to themselves and putting into their own words why something is true when answering the questions. So things like this is giving them a chance, like Lindsay said, to see where maybe they don't know, they can't put it together, but also gives them a chance to put it into their own mental framework, right? Because they're using their words and they're not just listening, but now they're actively trying to fit it into what they already know. So these sorts of things have impacts on learning, and these three structures encourage students to engage in them. If you're interested in sort of the cognitive science of learning, these are three great resources that kind of go through some of these and more, actually, and are great starting points. They're some of my favorite. All right. So high structure, again, prep assignments, in-class activities, and then some sort of review assignment every week, right? When this was done with the first instructor who developed this, it increased student performance on exams, it reduced performance disparities between students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And that was really exciting for us. But as I look at these results, you know, a couple of questions come up for me, and maybe you're thinking this too. You know, could this work for others instructors, or was it just this instructor? Could this work at other institutions, or was it just these students that were able to do this and learn from this structure, right? So to answer any of this, to have any chance at generalizability, right, we need to replicate. This is a case study. It's one instructor in one classroom. Case studies aren't generalizable. They're promising, they guide us, right? But we need more evidence across more context that this can actually work. And so that's where I came in. And I partnered with different biology instructors from across institutional contexts, so different R1s with very different populations, a community college, a regional university, and all of these instructors agreed to try out elements of high structure. They didn't all do all of them, but they all added pieces at least, or they did them in really unique ways. So like Dr. Sakavasa was running a hybrid course where half of her class is online, and she implemented these practices. That was nothing like the original implementation. But it has these core elements, right? So are these core elements enough to still create change across all these differences? All right, so I'm going to kind of quickly go through the results here. First, I'm going to talk about performance overall. We did find that everyone saw an increase in performance for their students. In our first replication, we did also reduce the disparity between Black and white students on exams by half. We also closed the disparities between continuing and first generation students in this classroom. However, disappointingly, we did not see any impact on disparities in the other 3 implementations. So what we learned is that incorporating these critical elements does seem to increase students' performance pretty consistently, right? 4 out of 4 of these replications. And the critical elements have the potential to reduce performance disparities, but they don't consistently do so. They're not enough, right? So 1 of the 4 replications plus the original is where we saw the closure of disparities. So this data really kind of got me thinking about, well, I've focused so much on structures and practices, but there's a lot more going on in the classroom, right? And so our next vignette is course climate. So course climate can mean a lot of different things, but it can be really important because when we ask students to do active learning in class, we're actually asking them to take a risk. We're asking them to talk about things they don't really totally understand yet. They're wrestling with them, right? They're learning with us, and they risk looking dumb in front of their peers. And that may sound like a small thing, but actually social comparison concern is one of the major drivers of human behavior. We don't like to look worse than our peers. That we will go through great efforts not to have that happen, right? And so one of those efforts may be disengaging and not talking, right, during active learning. Social comparison concern, when students are experiencing it, can heighten their anxiety and then reduce their engagement. So if we're asking them to do active learning, but we're triggering this, we're actually being kind of counterproductive, right? Because if they're not engaged in the activities, then they're not getting the benefit of those activities. So how do we make active learning feel safer and encourage student engagement? I think part of the answer, at least, is course climate. And what I mean by climate is 3 different things, and people define climate in different ways. These are mine. I think about the course norms, right? How should students in this course behave and what should they focus on? I think about the relationships that are being built in the class. And I think about the value that students see in the class. And for this talk, we're going to focus on relationships, but you're going to see pieces of these other things show up as well. So when we talk about relationship from sort of a psychology lens, we can define relationships in many different ways and use different qualities to kind of characterize them. We're going to use a definition based on something called social support. Social supports are aid that you receive from others. And the more aid you receive in a relationship, the better the quality of that relationship. So the type of supports, there's a lot of different types of supports, but in the classroom, people really talk about 4: informational support, instrumental support, appraisal support, and emotional support. So if we want to talk about support for engaging in active learning, which is our focus, I'm going to give you sort of descriptions of what that might look like in this context. So what might it look like? So informational support could look like students receiving information about the value of active learning for their success. It could look like establishing classroom norms of engagement. You know, to learn, you have to be active. Instrumental support could be things like clarifying the instructions, advising students on how best to engage in the activity to get the most out of it. Appraisal support is giving feedback, but that feedback celebrates not just correctness, but effort, right? That was a good try. Everyone is working so hard, things like that, right? And emotional support is fairly intuitive. It's having students feel cared for and accepted. But this is particularly important in the literature when they get something wrong. They still need to feel like they belong, right? They still need to feel cared for. So 2 undergrads and I worked to develop a survey that could measure these 4 types of instrumental support. So we went through a series of validation practices. We interviewed students. We did factor analyses to make sure that the items actually loaded on the factors we thought they were going to. We had expert reviewers, all of that. And we ultimately ended up with something that we call the Appraisal. And unfortunately, we never were able to resolve instrumental support. So as we move forward now, we're just going to focus on 3 types of support: informational, appraisal, and emotional. So our methods here, once we had the survey and we wanted to understand what was going on in the classroom, is we distributed the survey into 7 general chemistry classes that were in person, and then another 7 with the same instructors that were remote. So we were looking to see what is the role of instructor social supports in in-person classrooms and remote classrooms. And our predictors were students' perceptions of receiving those supports during active learning. And our outcomes were 2. We had buy-in. Do they actually believe that active learning will be helpful for their success in the course? And deep engagement. So deep engagement is engagement to understand and to learn, rather than engagement just to get the points or get the activity done, right? So we're interested in engagement that is effortful and focused on understanding. So we initially did some more validity evidence called invariance testing to establish that it was valid to compare the survey responses across in-person and remote classes. And then we engaged in structural equation modeling. So this, I'm going to walk you through our initial full model that we were working with. So deep engagement is our ultimate outcome. And we thought buy-in would predict this. And we thought our 3 social supports would increase buy-in if they were present and directly influence deep engagement, as well as influence deep engagement through buy-in. Okay. So I want you to make a prediction now in the chat, just on your own, or if you're in the room, just think about it. Which of these 3 social supports do you think will have the greatest impact on student engagement? So a lot of votes for emotional. Great. 10 more seconds if anyone wants to throw a last vote in there.
I can't see what it is.
Appraisal.
Yeah.
Great, great. So we've got some different ideas in the chat. So I'm gonna show you, here's the 2 classrooms, right? Well, it's 14 classrooms, but the 2 conditions, in person and remote. Here's the full model. And then I'm going to show you the paths that actually came up significant or trending. Okay. So first of all, our R² for explaining deep engagement in the in-person classrooms, I felt was actually pretty strong. I was surprised. So we're explaining about 36% of the variation that we're seeing in students, how students are engaging. And these are the pathways that were significant. So informational support directly influences deep engagement, but it also influences it by increasing buy-in, and buy-in influences deep engagement. Appraisal was trending, but you can see the effect is a little smaller, and there was more variation in that. In the remote classrooms, I thought this was really interesting. Our R-squared actually went up. So what the instructor is doing and whether students are buying in was even more important when students were online. We're explaining more of the variation of how they engage with our model. Okay, so here's what we saw there. So pretty similar, except appraisal now comes up as significant because it influences buy-in, and buy-in influences deep engagement. So informational support and appraisal were what was supported in our models. I will say, and I think this is really important, because emotional support, right, I also thought it was going to come out. But in general, these students were positive. So think about our responses tended to cluster on the positive side. So it wasn't like we had many students saying they were getting no emotional support. There was just not that range. So what I can say is that when students generally feel like they're being supported, that informational and appraisal become really important, more important than emotional. We also see in the K through 12 literature that younger students, emotional is more important to them. And then as students progress into high school, it actually becomes a little less. They're better able to handle kind of on their own without the emotional support, or maybe not without it, but it becomes less of a predictor of how they engage than these other forms of support. So pretty interesting, I think. So in conclusion, social supports from instructors, especially instructor framing of why active learning matters and how instructors give feedback, is important for deep engagement with course activities. So some of the suggestions that we came up with, what this might look like, is sharing with your students why you're including active learning in your course, that you're doing it for their benefit, right? Here's what they're going to get from it. Reminding them that mistakes are a natural part of learning. Why would you be in this class? Why would you be spending this money if you already knew how to do this, right? It's not a bad thing. That's why we're here. Encouraging students to engage in activities for understanding, not just for the points, right? And so my graduate student, Krista, helped me with this experiment, and she's expanding it to look at how learning assistants or undergraduate TAs add into this model. So when they're also present, what does support from them look like, and does it have a different effect than supports from the instructor? So our big hypothesis is that it's active learning paired with a climate conducive to engagement for all students that will be critical for maximizing the benefits of active learning. And so our model looks something like this, right? Students, you put course structures into place, students have to engage with them to benefit from them, and what's going to influence that engagement is the climate, the norms, the relationships, and the values that they see from the course. And we currently have an NSF grant to expand this study to 60 STEM classrooms across the country and try to actually build an explanatory model that takes into account the interaction between course climate and course structures. So that's where we're going with this now. All right. So the last vignette that I want to share with you is on course content and the role of course content in student outcomes. So the content that we choose to teach and what we choose to emphasize can influence student engagement and motivation. And we see this often brought up in a very positive way. So we talk about like relevance, for example. When you make learning personally meaningful, when you make it relevant, you see lots of positive outcomes. You can do relevance, right, by connecting to existing interests, to prior experiences that students have had, to prior knowledge that students have. Or you could demonstrate how content can be useful for fulfilling a personal goal that they have. There's a lot of different ways to bring up relevance. But relevance also has a dark side. It can also be potentially threatening. So if we think about, for example, a nice set of studies by Liz Barnes, On evolution and religious students, we see that evolution content, depending on how it's presented, which is really exciting, that it doesn't have to be threatening, but it can be threatening, and it can cause these students to disengage and to not see themselves as biologists. But, and again, this is the part that's so exciting, there are ways and things that instructors can do to structure how they present the content that reduces that threat from that relevance. Okay, so content can be both engaging and disengaging, right? Depending on how students perceive it. And so the group I want to focus on are not religious students, but students whose sex and genders don't align with the sex they were assigned at birth. Okay, so students in this sort of group sort of use a bunch of different language, and the language is always evolving. But you can think of words and folks like who use the word transgender, who use non-binary, who use gender non-conforming, right? All of these folks have this experience of their sex not aligning with what they were assigned at birth. And their population, the number of students with this identity is increasing. So if you look at this graph, we can see that as the age categories get younger, the percent of students who don't identify with the sex they were assigned at birth is increasing to as much as 12% in 18 to 34-year-olds. And this is actually maybe 5 years old now, so the number in our classrooms might be even larger, right? But if you have a class of 100, you might have 12 students who identify with these labels in your class. If you have 50, you might have 6. And education research on this population is lagging behind almost all other marginalized groups, especially at the college level. We don't know much about what is going on in STEM for these students, but we do know from one preliminary study that they tend to have lower retention in STEM than their cisgendered peers, their peers whose sex does align or gender does align with the sex they were assigned at birth. And in a talk I saw the same researcher give, he presented data showing that actually in biology, persistence was the worst. So he hasn't published this yet, so I'm curious to see how it plays out. But that was really suggestive to me and interesting. So we wanted to work on this question, and we are taking a qualitative approach, which is a very different approach than what I've shown you so far. Qualitative methods are not generalizable, but they get at the mechanism in a way that quantitative methods really don't, right? So I can tell you, right, that informational support influences learning from that quantitative study, but I can't tell you why that's true, right? If I paired it with a qualitative approach, which often involves interviews or written responses, in this case, interviews, if I interviewed students, I could get at the mechanism, right? I could ask them, what happened? What was your reaction? How did it help you, right? And then I could understand how informational support influences engagement better, right? It gives me possible mechanisms. So qualitative data, although not generalizable, will give you a range of possible mechanisms through which something is happening and just a sense of what's going on for students. And I say all this because I'm going to put this N up here, right? And we had an N of 5. So we interviewed 5 students in this study. This is not uncommon for qualitative work. We recruited these students from a large urban Hispanic serving university. You can see the genders, race, ethnicity, and majors of these students on the right. And our criteria for participation in the study was they had to experience a gender that does not align with the sex they were assigned at birth. And they had to have taken at least 3 biology classes. So they had something to talk about. Okay. So we did a 3-interview sequence with them. We spent 3 hours over 2 weeks with each of these students. We asked them about the narratives they encountered about sex and gender in their classes. We asked them to describe, sort of moments, critical moments that happened in the classroom around those narratives for them. And then how those experiences in those courses influence their identity development as a biologist, their sense of belonging, and their relationships. And we conducted qualitative content analysis. So I'm not going to go into it very deeply, but you read the interviews multiple times, iteratively, you come up with codes, then you code the interviews, you come to consensus with your other coders on what you're seeing and what they're seeing. You discuss the codes and you synthesize all of that into themes. And when we did that, we came up with 4 major themes. The first is that students were seeing 2 messages about sex and gender in their biology classes, gender essentialism, and this idea of biology as a neutral space. Both of these messages that they were receiving harmed these students, but they also demonstrated resilience to these harms. Explicit signaling of their inclusion helped them feel like they belonged in biology. And the students saw that biology content had the potential to actually validate their own experiences of sex and gender, but that wasn't a common experience in the classroom. Okay. So I'm going to really focus on the first 2 themes here and just give you some examples of how this idea of gender essentialism sort of manifested for these students. So students saw biology being presented in a way that was exclusively binary sex, so male and female, and that the orientations that they were being presented were exclusively heterosexual, that they weren't getting any mention of gender, right? So they were talking about sex, but not gender, and that often led to sort of a conflation of sex and gender, that there was this sort of emphasis on traditional sex roles and behaviors, and also an emphasis on dimorphism and difference rather than similarities. And this idea that the differences between males and females were fixed and innate with little discussion of the role of in the environment, right? And these things are one story that biology can tell for sure, right? But biology is the study of variation. There's a lot of stories biology can tell. But this is what these students felt like they were encountering exclusively. So I talked about how qualitative work lets you get at mechanism. So I want you to spend a moment really reading through one of these quotes and seeing how the different themes play out and connect to each other. So I'm going to provide you a quote, and I want you to look for our 3 themes. So gender essentialism, harm, and resilience in this quote. And I want you to think about how they connect to each other. So please take a minute and silently read through this and think about where you see these themes. This is a quote from a student who was currently questioning their gender identity. So about 20 more seconds. All right, why don't we come back together? And I want to show what I saw or what we saw as we were coding and see if it's similar to what you saw. So here, this top one in green is our example of gender essentialism, right? Here is an instructor basically saying to the student, there's only 2 sexes. And the student then identifies feelings that they're encountering that are harmful, right? They're feeling overwhelmed and confused because what the instructor is telling them and their own experience is contradictory. So we've got this cognitive dissonance, which can cause problems for students and impacts retention. Another harm further down in purple is around trust and relationship, right? The student says, I should trust this person. They're my instructor, but I just didn't. And then they show some resilience, right? They decided then and there that they are going to keep other people's opinions out here and really make their own, right? Do some critical thinking. They go on to talk about looking up resources online, reading about biology on their own, trying to make up their own mind, right? So we can see this connection to this message in the biology classroom, these feelings that it elicits in the students, and then how the student responds. And in a way, the resilience is another harm, right? Because they're distancing themselves and they're more questioning what the instructor says, which probably impacts the next thing that the instructor says, right? So it's having an impact on that relationship. There were additional harms identified as well. So relationship harm, as we talked about, but it wasn't just with the instructor. So in this quote, the student talks about their peers, and the student says, the moment that sex and genders topics come up in class, I look around and people are in agreement with it. If the professor said the color is red, it's red. They're not looking to challenge these ideas. It makes me extremely uncomfortable around my peers. I'm not close with my peers in my science classes. So there's relationship harm from these messages, not just from the instructor, but from the other students simply not responding to it or possibly agreeing with those messages. Another sort of surprising aspect of this, at least for me, was it also limited their access to opportunities and to resources. And this student explains this. So they say, not seeing myself represented in the content gives me a hard time building a personal relationship with the instructors, and that prevents me from getting a letter of recommendation so I can pursue future, academic endeavors, and I think that's a barrier for a lot of LGBTQ students. So not having a relationship makes it feel riskier to go ask for a letter of recommendation. They also talk about not getting research experiences because they don't feel safe talking to their instructors. And these students also saw this as a missed opportunity to educate. They recognize, and I don't know that it's the same at Oregon State, but at FIU, probably 95% of my students want to go into healthcare, right? And they see this, the students in the study saw that these themes, right, gender essentialism meant that we weren't addressing anything for healthcare providers. So exclusion of content on diverse genders or diverse sexes doesn't prepare students to work with diverse people in their careers. And this student says, you're teaching a class of people who are going to be scientists, people who are going to do research, people who are going to be healthcare providers. Talking about sexes and genders beyond the binary would bring a huge effect to a lot of other people's lives. I felt that it was such a good opportunity to go over and reconstruct what gender and sex is, but I guess the professor just wasn't really aware of that. All right. So these were some of the harms. There are more actually in the paper, but these were the ones I wanted to highlight for you all for time. So some of the conclusions from these interviews is that common biology content seemed to support gender essentialism and has multiple negative impacts on students who are trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming. We didn't have any intersex students in our sample. We're hoping to in the future. It erases these students' experiences of sex and gender and creates an inequitable learning environment by lowering their sense of belonging, decreasing their interest in biology content, making it harder for them to build relationships, and then limiting their access to career building steps. The students themselves thought that gender essentialism in biology was also reinforcing health disparities by reducing the training of future healthcare professionals, right? Their ability to understand, support, and deliver quality care to all their patients. And you would hope that med schools would do some of this work, but there was a recent study that most med schools have about 0 required classes or required time that they spend on these topics, and maybe have an elective. They also saw that it limited how future scientists would conceptualize and perform biology research, right? Our background assumptions matter. What we learn in our classroom build our background assumptions. And so ultimately it impacts the production of knowledge, and the students saw this. But biology content doesn't have to just tell this story. Biology is the study of variation, and there are other stories we can tell in our classrooms. And part of the work I'm engaging in now is working with a collective of folks, biology content experts, gender studies researchers, and biology education researchers, to think about how we talk about different topic areas in biology in our classes, and to make recommendations for how to do this in a way that supports students more broadly. Right? So my final model, sort of from my work and the way I think about the classroom, is that the course climate, the content, and all the structures matter, right? All of these inputs ultimately impact student performance and may also impact their sense of belonging in science and their persistence. And what's most exciting to me about this work is that it demonstrates that individual instructors can move the needle on equity and inclusion in biology. Our decisions about the structures we put into place, the climate we promote in the classroom, and the content we choose to include matters for students. The environment that they're in higher education matters, and we have the ability to change that. And increasing equity and inclusion isn't out of our hands, it's in our classrooms, right? And it's in what we prioritize and in the choices we make. And that's exciting, right? We have an opportunity here. Yeah, and with that, thank you for your time. Whoop, there we go. And I wanna, thank all my collaborators. And if there's time, I'd be happy to take any questions. And again, I appreciate you spending your Monday with me.
Thank you, Sarah. We are all clapping for you. This is
I
the
appreciate
power of
that,
the online environment.
True.
So convenient for being able to all get together, but yeah. All right, well, I'll just, I guess, open it up for questions. Anybody have anything for Sarah?
Can I ask a question?
Please.
I was just wondering if you did any, or are looking to in the future, do a comparison of like younger professors that are more aware of these social issues compared to kind of more strict heteronormative older professors, I guess. Like, I don't know if you see a difference in like generations, but I feel from my experience that is totally not at all what I received for my biology education. But a lot of my professors were not like that, I feel. So I'm just curious if you can like generalize it.
Yeah, so we can't generalize, right? This was done at one institution, but we have another grant to interview 60 students across the country. And through that grant, we have an opportunity to get at regional variation, right? It may be, for example, the Pacific Northwest is different than South Florida, right? And it may be that, I don't know that it's age so much as awareness or interest, training, right? So the other piece of this grant is to actually collect materials of folks from across the country and look at what themes are coming up in the course materials, and to actually show those materials to some student informants to see if what they feel is inclusive and what isn't, right? And how they would improve them. So it's a big grant kind of hitting on a couple of the things that you brought up. So can't answer it now, but hopefully in 3 years, we'll have more data for you. Thank you.
Any other questions? I don't know if there's any.
I can ask one. Hi, thank you for the talk. Great. So those students that I maybe I just missed it. Were they enrolled? Were they reflecting on these experiences from like what level of biology were those classes, or was that across the whole spectrum? Mostly I was wondering a little bit, because when we think about especially the idea of like two biological sexes, I feel like that's like a very vertebrate centric thing. And I was wondering if there was like an invertebrate class that they had taken, if they still felt that, or you still found those things in classes that were focusing either on like, you know, microorganisms or non-vertebrates. Plants. Exactly. Where there's like, because biology does have that huge diversity. So I just wanted to ask about kind of that population.
Yeah, so one piece of that population is that most of them wanted to go into health. So they were probably choosing classes, right, that were more of that. But they ranged from seniors to sophomores. They just had to have taken 3 classes. So some of them had taken all the required courses. They did, and I think this is one of the things that was exciting, they did see examples in class that were different, and they got excited about those examples and they remembered them. Fish that could change their sexes. They talked about plants, but that wasn't the common message, and they didn't feel like that was the dominant message, but there were these moments where they saw themselves represented in the content. So yes, I think those things are powerful, and a lot of us already do them. And it's thinking about maybe highlighting them a little bit more, right? There's so much diversity in biology. We could tell so many stories, and just give these students a little bit more, right, of the variation that exists in nature. So yeah, good point and good question.
Awesome, thank you.
Sarah, I teach human anatomy and physiology, and we don't actually talk about sex very much until we get to reproduction in the end of winter term, when these students have been with me for 6 months. And I feel like I do address this then, but thinking about ways to bring it in earlier, you know, there are certain places where we've been working towards using male or female bodies and not saying men and women. But even that doesn't quite get at it, right? So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about like when it's not directly relevant, like once we get to reproductive,
right,
it makes a lot more sense, and we can really dive in. But ways to like pepper things in and think about it earlier in content, or like kinds of language we could be using that can be inclusive.
I think there's really neat stuff that we can do with humans. There's an old medical model that Anne Fausto Sterling talks about, that is like the 13 layers of sex, and really pointing out that when we talk about sex with humans, we're actually talking about amalgamation of a bunch of different traits. So what do we actually mean? Like what, right? Like they layer on each other and they don't necessarily always align. So making space for intersex folks by that, having that conversation, right? I think can be really powerful, and even if you're not directly talking about students' experiences, they notice when you're being queer inclusive too, right? That signals something. And so that model of sex might be, you know, challenge them when you know, what are you actually thinking about when you talk about sex? You know, in biology, we talk about sperm and egg as the ultimate thing, but in the general public, that's definitely not what they're thinking about, right? It's often genitalia or what they can see, right? And those things can vary a lot, right? So I think that's a space. I also think it's powerful to say, we've gone this far in the term and we haven't had to talk about sex. How different are we really, right? And to explicitly say something like that, because if you look at the textbooks, we're actually reviewing one of Pearson's textbooks for inclusivity. They're asking us to do that, and like they start the chapter off with just emphasizing dimorphism, and dimorphism is cool, and we like extreme cases of it. It's interesting, but humans are not particularly dimorphic, right? And on the spectrum of organisms, we're definitely not. And so pointing that out can also be powerful. And I do that in VertZo. I'm like, we've gone this far in the semester and we haven't had to talk about sex. We're getting to reproduction, we're going to, but the further you get from reproduction, the less important that can be, right? We're not from, you know, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, right? It's not that different most of the time. There are cases, right? And there are traits, but not everything. So that's, I don't know, some ideas. Always happy to talk about more sometime. So hope that was somewhat useful.
Awesome. Well, I think that puts us right at 5:01, which is like 8:01 your time, Sarah. So thank you so much for spending your evening with us.
Yeah.
I really appreciate the insights that you bring and the diversity of the way you think about these questions and the instruments that you're using. So thanks for that as well.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So good to have you back. Thanks, folks. Have a good afternoon.
Have a good rest of your evening.